The Chinese white paper on defense that was issued on Monday, the 22nd of July, is a significant document with multiple relevances, particularly as far as India is concerned. I would like to look at this particular paper along four tracks, meaning that there are four important elements that merit some kind of preliminary comment. I do not want to suggest that this is an analysis. The first is global. Very clearly, this particular white paper, to my mind, is a kind of response to the way in which the United States has articulated its own strategic vision, which is reflected in both the QDR and the most recent US paper, which is 2018. So if you look at the first section, very clearly, it talks about the international environment, and I thought the first two lines are very relevant. This is about the new contestation between the United States and China, which is why the paper is also titled China's National Defense in the New Era. So the relevant paragraph in the white paper, which is looking at the global strategic environment and how the United States is positioning itself, says, I quote, "International strategic competition is on the rise. The US has adjusted its national security and defense strategies and adopted unilateral policies. It has provoked and intensified competition among major countries, significantly increased its defense expenditure." Unquote. So to my mind, this is the first frame of reference, the way in which China perceives the United States and how China proposes to deal with this challenge. This is the global dimension. The second is the regional. We are aware that China is dealing with a number of tense situations in relation to Japan and East Asia, also in relation to the South China Sea, and the way in which the maritime contestation is currently unfolding. Here again, the regional reference is very significant, and also I think by extension the kind of emphasis that is being placed on the PLA Navy, the maritime capability of China, the comprehensive maritime capability. I quote again, the white paper suggests that China is trying to bring Asia together into some kind of a peaceful cooperative structure, and there are references to SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the China-ASEAN Defense Ministers informal meeting, and the ADMM Plus, where India is also a participant. Here, interestingly, the quote I'd like to pick up is, it says, I quote, "The region has become," here the reference is to the ASEAN Southeast Asia region, "the region has become a focus of major country competition, bringing uncertainties to regional security." Again, it goes back to the United States and says, the US is strengthening its Asia-Pacific military alliances and reinforcing military deployment and intervention, adding complexity to regional security. Unquote. So there is a whole section, I would say, that relates to the Asian grid, particularly in relation to East Asia and ASEAN, and I think this is a section that would be of considerable relevance to India. The third strand that I'd like to pick up is, what are the sensitivities for China? Here it's predictable, often reduced to what they call as the three T's. Perhaps one could add a fourth T, but immediately in the white paper, the reference is to Taiwan. It's very clear that China is not going to compromise on what they call as the reunification. So some red lines are being drawn in relation to Taiwan, and this is a signal to the United States. Along with Taiwan, again predictably, there's reference to Tibet, which again, I think there is a subtext that would be relevant to India. And the third T is Turkestan, which is the current Chinese concern about Islamic jihadi terror and the way in which they are dealing with it by having these training camps and so on. So the three T's. I would also like to add that the greatest anxiety for China is the fourth T, which doesn't find explicit reference in the white paper, but this is the Tiananmen shadow, meaning this is 2019. China has just completed or observed the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen in June this year. And there is great anxiety, particularly after looking at developments in Hong Kong, as to what could possibly happen if the internal security and stability of China is not preserved in the appropriate manner. And again, if you look at the report, there is some interesting kind of division of responsibility, wherein the PLA army is identified to take on more internal security roles as opposed to the armed police. So I think that needs to be studied in some detail as to why the military is being given greater prominence. The last point which I'd like to pick up, which I think is of great relevance to India, is in the course of the white paper, there is reference to the way in which China has reorganized its fairly vast military. At one point, the Chinese military was almost 4 million. They have downsized. They have now come down to about 2 million. And the paper specifically refers to the reduction of about 300,000 troops and the way in which this is likely to now lead to a more lean and mean force. Now that's a very interesting observation in relevance or in relation to India, because we are currently observing, in a way, celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Kargil victory, July 1999. 26 July 1999 to be specific was Vijay Divas. But regrettably, in the Indian case, even 20 years later, many of the big ticket items which were identified in the Kargil Review Committee, for instance, the revamp of higher defense management in this country, the need to have a leaner force, as also to invest in technology, none of this has made really tangible progress in the Indian case. And I think that is the contrast that the policymakers and perhaps the more discerning citizen in India needs to focus on. And to me, again, as a security analyst, there is a very, very kind of sad irony that at a time when a country like China is organizing itself in a very, very, I would say, rational, predictable and persuasive way about how it sees military capability in its own comprehensive profile, China as an emerging power, India has deliberately or inadvertently ignored its military. It's almost diluting and degrading military capacity. We saw this in the budget. In the recent budget, it was very sad that the finance minister made hardly any reference to defense allocation. If you look at the nature of the expenditure, there is no money in the kitty. And in a rather incongruous sleight of hand, it was suggested that the government was being benign, charitable to the Indian military by waiving GST on certain imports. I mean, that was frankly very, very odd. But that seems to be the current political attitude in relation to the Indian military. And I think the unkindest cut, if I may put it that way, is that in the last week, literally, the government of India has taken a decision to award or approve what is called as the NFU, the non-functional upgrade, to all the officers in the CAPF, that is the Central Armed Police Force. This brings them on par with their civilian counterparts in what is called as the organized sector, the Class A service and so on. This has been denied to the Indian military. So in many ways now, the Indian military has become the equivalent of, if I could put it very strongly, the untouchable in the hierarchy of Indian governance. I think that is one aspect that India should be pondering over very carefully.